The Lord of the Rings trilogy is one of the greatest film trilogies of all time, and as we now know with time, it has become both beloved and a classic. So, inevitably, we knew that this wasn't it for Middle-earth. As only 9 years after the conclusion of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, we then had a prequel trilogy, the Hobbit Trilogy release. And this trilogy has had mixed reception from audiences. Some people accept it as a welcomed set of prequels to the Lord of the Rings films, while others liken it to the Star Wars prequels. To say the least, these films are controversial, so today I thought I'd take a look at whether the Hobbit films hold up compared to their predecessors, whether they stand well on their own, or whether they, well, failed. This is all my own opinion, of course, so let me know down below in the comments what your opinions on this trilogy are, and what bits of this video you agree and disagree with me on. Because at the end of the day here, I really want to make this video more about conversation than anything else. And likewise, there are going to be spoilers in this video, so you have been warned. And let's get into whether the Hobbit trilogy failed. I thought I'd start off with the obvious thing, which is the Hobbit trilogy is an adaptation of a single book by J.R.R. Tolkien. And this Hobbit book is shorter than all 3 of the Lord of the Rings books by 40 pages minimum, which is roughly 15% of the overall story. The Hobbit, if it was adapted using the same rules as the Lord of the Rings trilogy, we would have had roughly 2.5 hours to 3 hours of movie. Instead, we got 3 2 to 2.5 hour films. So some extra content had to be made. Some of these things include Thorin's overall character arc, Legolas's inclusion, Radagast's inclusion, Azog's inclusion, Tauriel's inclusion and her weird relationship with Keely, Gandalf's side quest, and so much more. But what do I actually think of this extra content? And I'm kind of on 2 minds about it. For starters, I think that there are some things that are actually welcome to be added in this trilogy. I feel like Gandalf's side quest makes a lot more sense to put on it than I initially thought. After all, he does just randomly disappear in the book, so it was nice seeing what happens there, and I'm fine with it being the connective tissue that brings us to the Lord of the Rings. Likewise, other things like the Battle of the Five Armies being longer makes a lot of sense given the fact it's a film. And I would also like to add that I think the additions to Thorin's character arc were actually really welcome here as well. I think that, as a whole, his arc was the thing that was doctored on to the best. But other things, like this Keely, Tauriel, Legolas love triangle, this Azog and Bolg and Sauron master plan, the flash forwards to Frodo that happen several times, Radagast's bits that randomly pop up in the films, Lake Town politics. There's a lot here that could have easily been cut. In fact, there is currently a 3-hour cut of the Hobbit trilogy named the Cardinal Cut on YouTube, and I think it shows how extensively you can cut content away from this trilogy without really losing much. And subsequently, as you can imagine, the pacing varies a lot in this trilogy. For the most part, I think An Unexpected Journey was a very slow-paced film at the start that suddenly sped up at the very end. Desolation of Smaug was the complete opposite, where it was very fast at the start and incredibly slow at the end. And Battle of the Five Armies was a very strange one where it felt like it was going so slow and so fast simultaneously. I should probably also add here that this was originally meant to be 2 films as well, so what happened in the development process? God knows. Now let's talk about characters, because, well, there are a lot of them in this trilogy. Some of them aren't even meant to be there, but nonetheless we'll go through them. For starters, I actually think that Martin Freeman is really charming as Bilbo Baggins and made for a really good presence. Whenever the films were just Bilbo interacting with people, they were at their absolute best, and I think it's mostly carried on Martin Freeman's shoulders, and it also had some really good dialogue behind it. When these Hobbit films were being The Hobbit, they were at their absolute best. Unfortunately, for the sake of padding out runtime, they couldn't quite make them all about the Hobbit. Which is where we get into the Dwarfs. Now, a whopping 2 of them were given character development, and most of the other ones were just given character types. The 2 that were given development are Thorin and Keely. And what I will say is, I think that Thorin's arc was a little bit more fleshed out through the Azog thing, through his birthright thing, through the gold sickness, and overall, it just about worked for me. I actually did find his whole arc very satisfied, and I remember distinctly watching the Battle of the Five Armies in the cinema and feeling very satisfied when he chose to break down that wall and join the battle. Richard Armitage gave a really good performance, and I honestly think that he is one of the more underrated parts of these movies. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for Keeley, who, I'm sorry, I just really didn't care for his character. All of his development was given to this romance thing here, which I guess as well, we'll talk about the elves, because the idea of this ridiculous love triangle and romance between a dwarf and an elf, it sucked, basically. I didn't buy the romance between these two characters, and they weren't developed enough outside of that for me to be interested in the slightest. Legolas is pretty much pointless here. The only real addition they give to his character is explaining that his mother died. And the only things that happen is a lot of stuff that, for the most part, fails the Benedictal test. Healy, Legolas, and Tauriel talk about nothing other than their relationships with each other, which very much slows the film down. Ian McKellen isn't in these films too much, however, he still, once again, is phenomenal as Gandalf. I'd also like to say that Andy Serkis and Benedict Cumberbatch did some amazing work with their mocap as Gollum and Smaug. Luke Evans was fine as Bard. I just about cared about him enough, although I feel like a lot of the extra screen time wasn't quite warranted. Most of the other side characters were fine. Oh, actually, no, there's one more I want to talk about. Alfred and Stephen Fry. I can't even remember his name. These two were annoying as hell. They shouldn't have been given half of the screen time they were given in this. I really don't know why they take up as much of the last two movies as they do. They were so annoying. And then, of course, there's the villain in Azog, who just sucked. Like, no disrespect to the actor or anything, but the idea of having an orc villain right away is a red flag. And they just designate so much time to him being part of this big conspiracy with Sauron, and he's got this nephew. It just wasn't necessary for the whole story. Honestly, they should have just been a group of orcs that were following them the whole time, or maybe Azog just happened to be there, I don't know. The point is, this didn't need to be some big plot here, and the fact it was really weighed down a lot of the plot. It also doesn't help that I think Azog looks kind of awful, which is where we go on to my second main thing I want to talk about, which is filmmaking, because I think the direction of the Hobbit movies is way worse than it is in Lord of the Rings. And for starters, there is so much more dependence on CGI. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a lot of makeup, there is a lot of on-location shooting, and there's a lot of good CGI. But there's also too much of it to the point where we can really easily see the bad CGI. So the good CGI things include things like Gollum and Smaug. A lot of the miniatures that they used also look really good. But then other things just didn't need to be CGI. There's a lot of CGI settings here that I feel like they could have done more convincingly. So many CGI characters, some of which warranted it, like the Great Goblin. Others, like Dane Ironfoot, did not need to be CGI whatever. And in the case of characters like Bolg and Azog, they were actively hampered by the fact that they weren't makeup and that they were CG. In fact, I don't think a single orc or goblin wasn't CG in this trilogy, which is really disappointing given the fact that the orc and Uruk-hai makeup in Lord of the Rings was some of the strongest makeup in cinema history at the time. As well as that, I think that Peter Jackson was almost too ambitious with some of the editing choices in this trilogy. I wouldn't say this was a necessarily badly shot movie or a badly edited movie, but just things like the weird coloring filters he decided to put on the movie, his weird 48 FPS experiment that he tried, these didn't pay off very well, and the fact that they were putting them here actively kind of just makes it harder for you to connect to these Hobbit movies. And And as well as this, I feel like the shot composition is fine. It doesn't really stand out as well as it did in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But nonetheless, I kind of just didn't really connect to any of the filmmaking here. It felt like Peter Jackson was kind of more excited by the prospects of including these new features like his weird coloring, like his weird FPS, that he didn't think about what made Lord of the Rings work. Which is where I kind of get to the conclusion of my thoughts on the trilogy, because I think there is stark contrast in quality between the three films. I think that An Unexpected Journey is a fine movie. I think that it is very focused, although very slow. I think that The Desolation of Smaug has an amazing first act and a terrible second act, and just a whatever third act. I think it did a lot of things right that the first film didn't do well. So overall I'd say it's a good film, but it definitely has its problems, and the Battle of the Five Armies really didn't work for me. I think that this film, like I said, it had so many unnecessary things in it, yet it also never really stopped. So right there you can see a stark contrast in quality, and that's my opinions on them as films. Now, in terms of follow-ups to Lord of the Rings, like I said, Peter Jackson's vision just feels like he wasn't paying attention to the fact this was linked to Lord of the Rings. I feel like it was actually in Peter Jackson's vision that these were their own three films, and that would work if he hadn't have put in so many things that link to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, like Gandalf's subplot, like the inclusion of Legolas, like characters like Gimli and Aragorn randomly getting name drops, like the constant flashbacks to Frodo and old Bilbo. They just weren't necessary in here, and they really confused whether this was trying to be its own thing or the Lord of the Rings prequel trilogy. So overall, do I think these films failed? No, not really. Because these films are so big and so long, and there are three of them, I feel like that you can get some real gold out of these films, which is why cuts like the Cardinal Cut and others are so much more interesting to me. Like with the Snyder Cut, there is literally so much content that some parts of it are amazing and other parts of it suck. But the fact that it's all out there means that you at least have the freedom to say the full quality is out there. As an average, would I say these films failed? Yes and no. I think as continuations, or rather prequels to Lord of the Rings, I think these films did not live up to the quality there. And I feel like for Peter Jackson's career, these films didn't work either. They just didn't have the same passion behind them. In terms of adaptations of The Hobbit, I'd say for the most part they were pretty good. Some of the soul was definitely lost due to it being padded out so much, but I didn't mind that so much. I feel like when it was adapting the book, it worked reasonably well. But did they fail as films? And honestly, I'm gonna say no. I can still watch these films and enjoy a lot of parts from them. And while yes, some of the promise from these films is admittedly spoiled, but regardless of that, I still think that these films are very enjoyable. And to be honest, I think that these films are overhated. Are they good? Yes and no. Are they bad? Yes and no. Ultimately, I'd be interested to know what you guys' opinions are on this, but that's all I'm going to really say here. If you want me to go more in depth on Lord of the Rings or each individual Hobbit film, then please leave a comment down below. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.